Hey everybody, your old pal Ben here. Welcome to the first Million Words, episode number 23. We're going to be doing something different this month. For the next few episodes or so, we are going to be talking to other podcasters. And I know you may think it's stupid to advertise other people's shows, but you know, that's how it works. We're a big community, we all love each other. And in this episode, we're going to talk to Luke Burrage, who does the science fiction book review, where he reads a book and then reviews it. Pretty simple, right? I love the world of podcasting. It's great. Later in the month, we'll talk to Dave from the Roundtable podcast. So those are a couple podcasts that you should also go listen to besides ours, because we're so awesome. But, you know, you can't just have awesomeness come from one area, you gotta diversify. So, Roundtable Podcast, Science Fiction Book Review, look them up on iTunes. Really just type in writing, type in fantasy, sci-fi, whatever. Do whatever you gotta do. So, without any further ado, here's the show. I hope you hate it. I mean, like it. Whatever. I'm tired. Bye. Right. The First Million Words, Episode 23, Luke Burrage, Part 1.
Headphones are not working.
That's fine. I can't hear myself echoing back through or anything.
Yeah, everything sounds good.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. All right.
Mike
Sorry
is
about
good.
that.
No problem.
Oh, it's
So,
okay.
Guillermo, I've really been enjoying the podcast so far. My name's Luke, by the way, in case you don't know who I am. I'm not sure if you've listened.
Yeah.
I'm
No, I
not
know.
sure if you've listened. I didn't know if you'd listened to the podcast or not, or read anything I'd written or anything like that. So.
Oh yeah, I've been on your site, checked out your reviews and stuff. So yeah, it's.
Oh, that's cool.
Reading.
You know, I have a question before we start. What is a Mills mess?
Why do you ask?
Because I think I saw that on your one of the videos you have on YouTube.
Oh yeah, on one percent. Oh yeah. So there's what you do is if you juggle and cross and uncross your arms at the same time, it looks like a complete mess. So there's a guy called Steve Mills who invented a trick. It's a very kind of foundational trick with crossing and uncrossing arms, and it's called Mills mess. He called it because it looks like a mess. And and then there's lots of other variations of Mills mess or other crossing and uncrossing of arms tricks, which are now also called something mess, like
That's cool.
Mike's mess or other things. Yeah. So there you go.
That is really fun to watch.
Well, I've been performing variations of the act since 2003, so it's pretty well locked in at this point. If you know. What I mean.
Yeah. Does that ever get old? Doing
No,
the same,
I love it because it's like one of the highlights of my show, and people go crazy for it. And every time I do it, not the actual video piece, because when I'm juggling to the video is set, you know, and I have to say what's coming up. I can't. There's no ad-libbing when there's the video playing and the words are coming up, so I've got to do that. But in the introduction, you can see in the introduction I mess around and talk, and it's actually a lot funnier now than it is in there. But you know, because I've got some different jokes and different bits and pieces in it. But really, it's just me talking for 5 minutes or 4 minutes about 3-ball juggling, which most people would probably find not so interesting, but when it builds up and then that is the payoff at the end, that 2-minute video is the payoff. Or the 2-minute juggling act with the video is the payoff. It gets a big reaction, which is always good.
Yeah, that's fun. Is that something you were kind of born into, was juggling? Like I always imagine people who go into.
No, not really. I started 20 years ago. But it was just a very small hobby. Like my father took me along to a juggling and circus skills workshop, and I started there. And then, it's been my job though since 2003. 2003 was when I quit my last real job. So yeah, almost I'm coming at 10 years almost in a way.
Yeah, nice. And that was
8-9 years.
So it's juggling and kind of writing on the side?
Yeah, I'm not a professional at all, and I'm going to talk about this in a bit if you want in the actual proper podcast stuff.
Oh yeah,
as well.
This might make it into the podcast.
This bit? Oh,
yeah.
Really? No, because I'm talking about stuff that nobody has got any clue about. So, oh yeah, because that's the weird thing that you just do a fade in, don't you? You just like do, and the music fades out, the out of time country music or whatever it is that fades out.
Yeah, I prefer to just kind of jump in the middle of it. Yeah.
No, I really enjoy that because you're like, wow, what have they been talking about up until now? And then at the end, it kind of just fades out as well, and you realize, oh, the conversation kind of, and you're like, oh, I want a bit more. I want a bit. So it's like it always feels like it's part of a long conversation, and I actually really enjoy that. I know it's a weird thing, but that slow fade in, you kind of okay, what are they talking about here? What's going on here? What's going on? Oh yeah, I got it like that.
Exactly.
Like when you're dropped into a TV show or a movie, which you're not quite sure what's going on, and it takes you of course, a few scenes to pick it up, and normally with a conversation you can pick it up quite quickly. But yeah, I actually really enjoy that fading in and out.
And that's our show.
Okay.
And I threw Guillermo in there.
So should we start this off then?
Well, sure thing. Yeah, let's start with. I met you virtually online.
Yes.
Because you do a podcast as well.
Yeah.
What's the official name of that?
It's called the Science Fiction Book Review Podcast because in it is a podcast where I review science fiction books, also audiobooks, and also fantasy books as well. So it kind of changes as I go along. But I thought the Google Juice would be very kind, or Google would be very kind to me if the title of my podcast includes everything about it. I'm a big believer in naming products in that way. If you want them to be found, do it. So that's how How did you find the podcast then?
I think that way. I think it was just through. I was just going from one. I was kind of sampling all the different like sci-fi or fantasy or horror book podcasts that were out there, and I was jumping from one to the other. About at the bottom they have if you like this, you should also listen to this, and I think that's how I found yours. Yeah, I found
some really interesting podcasts that way, and also in Google Reader as well. Google Reader, if you're subscribed to some podcasts, like if someone is a guest, like if someone from one podcast is a guest on another podcast, it'll often kind of flag that up in a way that you don't realize they've been a guest on somewhere else, and you're like, and it recommends it to you, and you check it out, and you're like, oh, I know this guy, he was over here, or I know this guy, it was there. But no, it's great. And so what happened was that you sent me a message. I can't remember what it was about. Was it about swearing in? I remember this. And yeah, it was about swearing in the Way of Kings.
In the Way of Kings, yeah.
Novel. Did you read that novel?
That actually, yes. I listened to the audiobook. Okay. And that was what got me back into reading the sci-fi and fantasy genre. Was that book? Yeah.
What about you, Guillermo? Did you read Way of Kings?
I have not read it just yet, unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah, but you said
I've been told the basic gist of the cursing system.
Yeah, just terrible. So, well, I went into it probably in a little bit too much detail, and I think my longest ever podcast that I recorded there, which is about Way of Kings, which is probably one of the longest books I've reviewed on the podcast. Yeah. So, but there was a lot of stuff to talk about, and you actually sent me a message. I think it was on Goodreads.com. You said, "Hey, check out," because we actually talk about that with Michael Sullivan. Michael, was it?
Michael Sullivan, yeah.
Was it Michael J. Sullivan? Is that it?
Well, yeah, but whenever, either one, yeah.
Yeah, but whenever you say Michael J. Sullivan, I always think Michael J. Fox.
I know, me too, sorry. Yeah. I had to stop myself every time we talk to him, yeah.
Yeah, you kind of covered a similar point there, but like probably not in as much detail as I did, because I kind of went into the reasons and had a good swearing session. Although I was trying to, of course, when I was doing that, because I sometimes have notes to record, but in that case, it was such a big book, I didn't have in-depth notes or even that many notes. I was just going through. But one thing that I definitely wanted to bring up was the swearing, and then I had fun trying to come up with swear words on the fly in using different roots of different swear words and based on the book, which is probably a bit stuttering, but I think it was fun.
Yeah,
you weren't the only person to say they enjoyed that. So let me put it that way. Yeah,
yeah, I did really like that book, but yeah, the whole using storm as a swear word, especially when one person was telling the other person to storm off.
Yeah, storm off you. It's like, no, you have to say, well, I don't know what we can swear on this podcast or not. You've got to say F off, or, you've got to make it offensive. Otherwise, a storm, it would be like saying rain off, or I don't know. It was weird. Again, I don't want to rehash two different podcasts,
yeah.
one episode of your podcast and an episode of my podcast about this one topic. But yeah, it was good. So we said, hey, come on, we'll talk about whatever.
And one of the topics we wanted to start off with, which is actually what we kind of have been ending with people now, is how to finish something. And you said you wanted to talk a bit about that, especially after hearing the Rachel Aaron episodes.
Well, no, it wasn't. Yeah, because the thing is, you've been asking your guest this, but I mean, I've listened to two authors so far. The Brian Thomas Schmidt, I say interview, but it's like series, isn't it? Month. Yeah. And then the Michael J. Sullivan, and I listened to the first two with Rachel Aaron, but that's when we're recording. So if you're wondering what day it is, you can probably work out what week we're recording this. So I haven't heard what the other people say about finishing projects, but as well as being a science fiction book review podcaster, I also do I have lots of other projects as well, different things, and one thing that I do is write novels or novella length kind of novella to novel length kind of fiction myself. So what were we talking about? Oh yeah, finishing a project, building on things that whatever advice you always get from authors. And I've actually do you know the Writing Excuses podcast?
Oh yes.
So in there, they often do these like, hey, let's do a workshop and we'll come up with ideas. We'll come up with ideas, story ideas. Now, hearing them do many podcasts about this really started getting to me. So I went on to the response forum kind of thing that they do there, and I said, look, this is really strange, because what you're doing, I mean, you're selling the wrong idea of what a story is to people. You're always saying about, hey, here's a good story idea, but what you have is a scenario. All you have is a character, normally a character or a world building element or a fun thing. It's like, how about, and they take these ideas from newspapers and they say, hey, check it out. I mean, it's a great podcast. I'm not knocking the overall podcast, but there was just this one specific thing that I had to get in contact with them and say, you've got to come up with an end to a story. Because if a story doesn't have an end, it's not, I mean, you can say it's a story, but this is the big difference between, say, as an example, Brandon Sanderson, because he's coming up twice already, and he has ends to his books. When you get to the end of a book, something happens, and you know that it's the end. It's happened, and the storylines are resolved in a way which is interesting. And I know that he plots his stuff, and he knows what's going to happen at the end. And then you get another author who has come up a few times, is like, say, someone like Stephen King, who doesn't always have an end in mind as he like when he starts a project. Yeah. And when you start getting to the point where he thinks, oh, okay, you're gonna have to start wrapping up here. This is not my experience because I've not read a lot of his novels, but most people say that the endings of his novels they kind of a bit like, okay, if we're going to go that way, okay, like that. And other novels that I've read, which they just kind of finish, especially with fantasy novels. You read a first book in a fantasy, and it just stops after a while. Like the Game of Thrones, people go around here and do this and do that, and sure, they have a big battle at the end, but you're like, nothing that you set up at the beginning has paid off in the end. Now, on the Writing Excuses, they always say, if you make a promise to the reader, you've got to fulfill the promise to the reader. However, it's really difficult when you start thinking about a story in terms of like setting up questions, and then you start writing the story and you don't have the answers to those questions. You've not got a point to build towards. And I think and so after me sort of complaining in their forum, or it's like a blog, so there's comments on every episode, so I mentioned in that, and they were like, oh, you don't need to be sniffy about it, and I say, well, do an episode about coming up with a story idea that has an end. So they put this podcast out, which they kind of did that, but they spent a long time going through the story, and then like in the last 30 seconds they're like, oh, this is meant to be about endings, and so they spent the last 30 seconds like coming up with an ending, and the endings were really good. Again, I'm not knocking it, because you got like these now four genius guys and now a girl on the podcast. I think girl, ladies and gentlemen here on this podcast, and they're genius. I mean, they're all very successful. They're doing really great work, all of them. But again, the way that they write, I don't think. Like Brandon Sanderson, he writes these long form novels, and it's so obvious to him that at the end of all of his stories, he's got a really cool action scene that he's building towards. He's got this big magic system that's going to come in. He's got a twist here, a twist there. This person's going to be the same as this person. This person's going to turn out that this magic is going to bring this thing alive, and everything's going to play out. He's writing towards that in the entire novel. And you know, and then Howard does. He's an online
schlock mercenary.
Yeah, the comic strip. So he actually starts off, and he doesn't know exactly what's going to happen. He actually says, I get like 2/3 of the way through my story, and then I work out exactly what needs to happen at the end, which is another thing. But he's got another thing to keep him going on. So, like, the way that they actually write stories, for them, endings aren't a problem, because the way that they write, they already know exactly what's going to happen at the end. And I think they, again, I don't always bring it down to this, but I think if you're going to start a story and you want to finish the story, the most important thing that you can do is to have a really good ending in mind. And while that ending, it doesn't have to be a twist ending, it doesn't have to be a gotcha ending, it doesn't have to be a classic ending, but you have to have a point. It's like, okay, at the end of this novel or at the end of this story, where do I want the world, you know, what do I want to have changed in this world? And it could be just a character changing. It could have been like a character going somewhere and then coming back again, you know, like in The Hobbit, you know, or even in the Lord of the Rings. You get these are two stories about people going somewhere and then getting home again. And you know when it's going to end because it's like they get home again. Although the Lord of the Rings carries on a bit, especially in the movies, and carries on, you know. But even then, you know when it's going to, it's sort of like a natural ending point. And I think so many people start a project and they have an idea for a character, they've got an idea for a story, but they don't have a really strong ending in mind. And I think that one of the easiest ways to come up with an ending is to do a twist ending. It doesn't have to be a good twist ending, but it's something to write towards. And if you have that thing to write towards, you can make it easier to get to that point. And I think that's one of the most important things that I do with my writing, because I know it. I've done it before. I've got 40,000 words into a story and went, oh, the ending. Oh, yeah, I knew I should have come up with it. And I realized what the ending's going to be, and I was like, oh, this is going to be a great ending. And I realized I have to go back and rewrite this thing from the beginning. And because there was this one project that I've been working on and off for years, which is a retelling of the War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells from the point of view of the Martians, from the point of view of the aliens. Nice. And you'd think, oh, well, you've got that. I've got that in mind, you know. And you think, well, that's, yeah, of course, because I'm just going to tell the same story. And I started writing it. But as I was going through, I actually worked out that the ending has to be different and has to be way cooler than I first imagined. And the most important point, again, spoilers for anyone who's, well, I'm probably never going to finish it, so it doesn't really matter. But the whole point is that there's this whole section in that movie about the humans going underground, you know, the artilleryman who he meets, and they start digging a section. They start digging underground, and they're going to go down and live underneath the Martians. And I realize now the cool ending of this has to be at the end of the story. Actually, not all of the aliens die, but some of them go down and live under London and are down there as these monsters under London. And you know what happens? They still come out and catch people and still drink their blood, because that's what they do. They need that to survive. And I thought, and when I suddenly had that realization, I was like, oh, of course that has to be the way it ends. Because, you know, people who know the original story, like or even the Brave New World with just a handful of, you know, that whole kind of stuff going on there. Then I was like, that's what has to happen with my characters, with my main character. He has to be the artilleryman of the other side who realizes everything's going to shit here. I need to go and hide under the world. And when I suddenly had that idea in mind, I realized actually that's what I need to be writing towards from the start. So I stopped writing because I realized everything I had written up into that point, I hadn't been writing to that point. And I realized if I'd have just carried on writing and tried to sort of try to sort of kind of steer that ship, steer the Titanic around, and miss the iceberg, you know, it just wasn't going to happen. I was going to hit the iceberg of like running into story problems, get fed up, and just stop writing. And so I just stopped. And I know that next time I take a run at this story, I'll have to start again from the beginning, and I'll be writing towards an end point. And there's loads of other stuff that I want to write about along the way. You know, I was writing about what it's like to drive one of the fighting machines, which you never get from that, you know, from the other side of the other point of view. And there's lots of other ideas that I had in there. But like once I suddenly had that end point had crystallized in my brain, I realized I wasn't going to finish it. I know that's a different point of view, but I've done this in a few stories where I've started off and I thought, oh, this would be great, and then I was like, actually no, I'm never going to finish this unless I have an ending in mind. What do you think about that, then? Is that some advice that you like?
I like that. Yeah, make sure you have your ending, and something else too is once you have your ending, kind of another problem becomes where do you begin? And I think the best place to begin is the opposite place of the ending. And that's always the most interesting thing to write, is the main character going from his or hers or its roots in one direction and just totally ending on a different note at the end.
Yeah, again, that's one way to do it. I mean, there's lots of different ways, but I think starting points are easier to get is easier to get wrong and go back and fix later than an end point. I know that's weird to say, but like if you start a story, and I've done this before as well, I started a story and then I've read the first chapter and I was like, wow, that's like really redundant. I don't need any of that. It's like, why do I have this character meeting then? They're going to meet in the next scene anyway. I'll just put the 3 bits of information that they get in that first scene, I'll just put it into the second scene, and I can just chop all that off and just get on with it, actually get the story started. No, I'm not saying there's a whole story theory where you have like the inciting incident and they turn it down, and then there's another one, go for it. There's a whole classic 3-act structure that you can do, but often stories start probably too early, let me put it that way. Sometimes they start too late, and that's the thing that I get into with reviewing is the that is that something, is that the way it was? Anyway, it's like he said I can't remember. Then. Anyway, so it's when you're telling a story of someone telling a story in where out of sequence, like the in media res kind of thing, where you drop them in and you go, let's start talking. It's like, oh, well, I had just done that, and he had just like a few minutes before he had said this. It's just a weird situation when you're reading it. You're like, well, why didn't you just start telling the story like 2 minutes earlier when they actually got into that scene? I just started reading or listening to an audiobook called Red Shirts.
The Scalzi, right?
Scalzi, yeah. And so, first of all, Will Wheaton, terrible narrator. Second of all, it starts and it's sort of like he's on a rock and he says something, and then it says a minute before, this other person said this to him, and that's why he just replied with what he had just said, which is okay. I mean, to be honest, in my book, in my novel Minding Tomorrow, I do a similar kind of thing. In the very opening line, you hear the opening line, and then you're like, and then he sort of reflects about what happened in the second before that. However, in that case, it kind of, I like to think it works a bit better because it's like a line which kind of catches him out, and he's like, oh, why did she use that tone of voice? What did I just do? What was I just doing for her to use that tone of voice? He's actually suddenly thinks back and goes, okay, what's she going to say next? So there's it's a little reflecting thing, but I never understand why an author would just suddenly go, he came in through the door. What's you doing? He said. He thought back, well, a minute ago I was walking up the stairs and I said this to this guy. It's always a strange thing. It's just like you can start a bit. It's okay to start when they're running up the stairs. You don't have to start bursting through the door. You can do the bit, the bit of dialogue outside. You don't have to explain it. You can go into less detail about it. But yeah, it's a certain thing. Sometimes I wish stories would start later, and sometimes I wish that they'd include a bit more beforehand. I don't know. Just some of the
that's a little tough deciding where exactly to start it. Well, Guillermo, did you have any? Do you have an ending in mind, Guillermo, for your the thing that you're working on right now?
I do. It's just getting to it that.
Oh yeah.
But I don't know. It's like mine doesn't have any crazy twist ending. It's
just the world explodes, right?
Yeah. Well, everyone gets hit by a bus.
Well, that's the great thing. I mean, that's the really good thing that I like about some disaster movies, that it ends like they get to the end and they save the day, and it's like, great, the world didn't end. That's great. But in other times, I was just reading The Stand. What I like about that is that it starts off with a disaster and then everything plays out. Whereas other novels that you read, which are disaster novels, a few come to mind, like the Lucifer's Hammer. where it's sort of like setting up the disaster. Disaster happens, and they're like, we still got a third of the book to go. What can happen? Well, I guess the people afterwards can fight a bit. Okay, let's do that. And you're just like, wait a second. It was about a meteor hitting Earth. That was really awesome. If it just like the meteor come and hit the Earth, you're like, yeah. Or if it doesn't hit the Earth, you're like, yeah. You're like Armageddon had it right. Or, what was the other one? Deep Impact.
Deep Impact, yeah.
They all do the stuff. They go out and save it. In one case, the Earth gets hit. In the other case, which one? Yeah. Anyway, I remember seeing tidal waves. So one of them gets hit, and you're like, yeah, great ending. And at the end, you're just like, that was it. We got the big special effects sequence at the end. The world ended / didn't end. Enjoy.
Roll the credits. Yeah.
Roll credits. Like that. And with Lucifer's Hammer, it's like the world hit, and guess what? This person drove a really long way and died, and this person, they drove and drove and drove, and they survived. And this person, because he's white, is a good person, and he survives. And these black people over here, they're eating people now because they're black people. And they got all that kind of stuff, and then you're like, oh, now what do we do with all these characters? They haven't come together. I was always expecting like they would all arrive at the same point. I think that's what happens in Deep Impact, isn't it? You got all these disparate people, and they're all trying to get to the same place, and they kind of meet up in the end.
They're all just kind of going inland, and Elijah Wood on a motorcycle.
Yeah, and you can see that they're all heading in the same direction. Whereas it was in Lucifer's Hammer, that kind of happens a bit. But when they get there, there's some people are like, hey, we're all getting on. And other people are going, well, we've got to subjugate women. And the women are like, okay. And, there's this whole, you got going, you just sort of, wow, that's sort of like flopped around until someone decided to end it. Of course, they had an ending in mind, which is like, yay, nuclear power. But, it was a bit weird once you got there. I don't know. I don't consider Lucifer's Hammer a very good book, but even though it seems to be held up in lots of, in high regard by lots of people, I don't know. It's a weird thing. Yeah. So have an ending to work towards it.
I with the endings, and Guillermo kind of touched on this a little bit. Something my dad always used to tell me when I first said, "Hey, I like writing," was he mentioned an old article from National Lampoons. Back when it was like a magazine.
Yeah.
And it's always like, hey, aspiring writers, if you ever are looking for the right place to end your novel and you get stuck, just end it with, and suddenly everyone was hit by a truck.
Oh, I see.
So like I always,
I didn't get that reference.
Yeah, I always have a tendency to do that as kind of a placeholder when I'm trying to think of an ending. It's like, okay, everybody could get run over by a truck.
Hey, but then in Final Destination, they had that ending in mind, I think, wasn't it? And you're not quite sure if the guy at the very end is going to die or not. I mean, I'm talking about a movie which is 15 years old here, but there is that element to it. It's sort of like people, in the end, let's just kill everyone by a bus. Okay, works for me. Okay, let's do it.
Yeah, I think in that case it was a falling sign in Paris.
Oh yeah, that was it. Yeah, they go to Paris, don't they? And this sign swings around, and the guy stands up and is like, "Hey, we made it. So who's next on the list to die?" and this spoiler, the sign swings back, but you don't see if he dead. Well, of course he dies. But you get to that point where like, oh, I've never seen any of the other Final Destination movies up until Final Destination. What, we have to now 54 or something? Final Destination movies?
Yeah, it
feels like that. Yeah, it's plenty of them.
It's in Splatter 3D where the blood splatters from the screen and hits you in the face. Yeah, it's good.
Final Destination 5D.
Yes, all five.
I don't know what the fifth. I don't know the fifth yet.
I think you actually get mysteriously somehow killed at the end of the movie.
Everybody dies at the end.
There were really spikes going to shoot me through the chest.